Welcome to Philosophical Frontiers. Today we are diving into a paradox that has tied ethicists in knots for decades, and we are going to look at a radical, mind-bending metaphysical solution to it. We are talking about the non-identity problem, specifically framed around a hypothetical case of a child named Shia. Imagine a couple wants to have a child. The doctor tells them that if they conceive immediately, their child, let us call her Shia, will be born with a debilitating condition. Her life will still be worth living, but she will suffer. However, if the couple simply waits 1 month for a brief medical treatment, they will conceive a different, totally healthy child. Intuitively, almost everyone feels that conceiving immediately is morally wrong. But when you break it down into 4 logical claims, things fall apart completely. Claim 1, conceiving immediately was morally wrong. Claim 2, it was wrong only if it was bad for Shia, which relies on the person-affecting principle, meaning an act is only wrong if it negatively affects a specific person. Claim 3, it was bad for Shia only if Shia would have existed had they waited, which is based on the counterfactual comparative view, meaning you can only be harmed if you are worse off than you would have been in the alternative scenario. And finally, Claim 4, Shia would not have existed had they waited, because she would be made from entirely different genetic material. These 4 claims seem individually true, but logically, they contradict each other.
Exactly. It is a perfect trap. If Claim 4 is true, meaning Shia would not exist if they waited, then waiting cannot be better for her. You cannot compare existence with non-existence. So if Claim 3 holds, conceiving immediately wasn't bad for her. If Claim 2 holds, it wasn't wrong. But that shatters our strong intuition in Claim 1. The standard response in philosophy has been to bite the bullet and reject one of the first 3 claims. Some philosophers abandon the person-affecting principle, saying you can do wrong without harming a specific person. Others drop the counterfactual comparative view. But notice what all these standard responses have in common. They all just accept Claim 4 as an unquestionable, rock-solid fact. They assume that, of course, Shia would not have existed if they waited, treating it purely as basic biology. But the paper we are looking at today, Shamik Dasgupta's piece, completely flips the script by arguing that Claim 4 is not a biological fact at all, but rather a deeply contestable metaphysical thesis.
That is exactly where this paper gets fascinating. How does Dasgupta challenge Claim 4? Because on the surface, saying a child conceived a month later from a different egg and sperm is a different child seems like common sense. What is the hidden metaphysical baggage here?
The baggage is essentialism. Claim 4 assumes that Shia has certain properties essentially, meaning she absolutely must have them to be the entity she is. If you change an essential property, the entity ceases to exist. This is contrasted with accidental properties, like hair color, which can change without destroying the entity. To say Shia wouldn't exist if her parents waited is to say her specific genetic code or her exact time of conception is part of her essential profile. The essential profile is the complete list of an object's essential properties and individuating properties. Without this assumption of essentialism, Claim 4 falls apart. Anti-essentialists completely reject this kind of modal logic, making Claim 4 meaningless. But Dasgupta says, let us grant essentialism for a moment, but we need to look really closely at what flavor of essentialism we are using. He introduces a critical distinction between descriptive essentialism and ontic essentialism. Descriptive essentialism says that whether a property is essential depends purely on how you describe the object. But ontic essentialism, which Dasgupta adopts as his first working assumption, argues that essentiality is an objective feature of reality, completely independent of how we describe things.
Okay, so ontic essentialism means objects have their essences baked into them in the real world. But how does that lead us to the weird conclusions Dasgupta needs? I know he brings in the classic statue and clay example here.
Right. The statue and the lump of clay is the classic way to understand this. Imagine a statue made of clay. Under ontic essentialism, the statue has the property of being statue-shaped essentially. If you smash it, the statue is destroyed. But the lump of clay only has that shape accidentally. If you smash it, the lump of clay still exists, just in a different shape. Because they have different essential properties, the statue and the lump of clay must be 2 distinct entities. Yet, they occupy the exact same physical space and share the exact same matter. This gives us the concept of coincident objects. Accepting Claim 4 for human beings relies on the exact same logic. If you accept that Shia essentially has her specific origins, you are buying into the hylomorphic idea that matter and form are distinct, and therefore you are buying into the reality of coincident entities occupying the same space.
That is quite a leap. So if I am sitting here in my chair, there isn't just one entity here? But Dasgupta pushes this even further, doesn't he? He moves from just a few coincident objects to something called unlimited essentialism.
Yes, he dials it up to infinity. If we accept that coincident objects exist, like the statue and the clay, Dasgupta asks, well, how many are there? Limited essentialism says there are only a few, but unlimited essentialism, which is Dasgupta's second major assumption, says that for every possible subset of your non-modal properties, there is a distinct entity coincident with you. So right now, where you are sitting, there is the entity we call you. But there is also an entity we could call sitting you, which has the essential property of sitting and will literally cease to exist the moment you stand up. And crucially, for our non-identity problem, among this infinity of coincident objects occupying Shia's physical space, there are some entities that have her exact genetic origins essentially, and there are other coincident entities that have those origins purely accidentally.
This feels like we are losing our grip on reality. But I know this massive metaphysical buildup is absolutely necessary for the core of his argument. And this leads us to what is easily the most memorable part of the paper, the breakfaster's thought experiment. Walk us through this, because this is where we start to see the fatal flaw in the standard non-identity debate.
The breakfaster's thought experiment is brilliant. Imagine an alien, or just a very strange human community, who sincerely believes that whatever a mother eats for breakfast on the 10th day of her pregnancy constitutes the essential property of her child. If she eats cereal, one entity comes into existence. If she eats cheese, a completely different entity is born. So, we have a woman in this community named Sabita. She chooses to eat cheese on day 10, and she gives birth to a child, let's call her Tia, who suffers from the exact same debilitating condition as Shah in our original example. Now, Sabita uses the exact same logic from our claims 1 through 4 to justify her choice. She says, yes, Tia is suffering, but if I had eaten cereal, Tia would not exist. Therefore, by the counterfactual comparative view, I didn't harm Tia, and by the person-affecting principle, I did nothing wrong.
Sabita's logic is identical to the standard logic of the non-identity problem. But intuitively, we all look at Sabita and think she has lost her mind. Breakfast has no moral relevance whatsoever. Where exactly is the error in Sabita's thinking, according to Dasgupta?
Sabita's error is that she is tracking the wrong entity. Remember unlimited essentialism? There really is an entity occupying that child's space that essentially depends on the cheese breakfast. Dasgupta calls these bizarre entities Shmeeple. So claim 4 is completely true when applied to Shmeeple. But here is the punchline. Shmeeple do not matter morally. The entities we care about when we make ethical judgments, the entities that the person-affecting principle quantifies over, are not Shmeeple. Sabita has successfully proven that she didn't harm a Shmeeple, but she entirely ignored the morally relevant entity, the actual child, who absolutely would have existed regardless of what she ate for breakfast. Dasgupta's devastating critique is that when we look at the original Shah case, we are making the exact same mistake Sabita is making.
Oh wow. So Dasgupta is saying that in the original case, when we confidently state claim 4, that Shia wouldn't exist if her parents had waited, we are fixating on an entity that is just as morally irrelevant as Sabita's Shmeeple?
Exactly. Dasgupta introduces the concept of flexistentialism to explain this. In Shah's physical space, there are countless coincident entities. One of them is what he calls a person-likes entity. A person-likes entity has its specific genetic origins essentially. If the parents wait a month, the person-likes entity never exists. Claim 4 is undeniably true of the person-likes entity, but Dasgupta argues that the person-likes entity is morally meaningless, just like the Shmeeple. What actually matters morally is a different coincident entity, which he calls the practical person. The practical person has a highly flexible essential profile. Perhaps its only essential property is simply being the first child born to this couple. Because its essential profile is so flexible, this practical person would still exist even if the parents waited a month to conceive.
So, flexistentialism resolves the paradox by disambiguating the entities. Claim 4 is true of the person-likes entity, but false of the practical person. Meanwhile, claims 1, 2, and 3 are true of the practical person. Therefore, the 4 claims are no longer logically inconsistent. We can keep our moral intuition that it was wrong, we can keep the person-affecting principle, and we can keep the counterfactual comparative view, all because the practical person survives the counterfactual change. But this is a massive claim to make. How does Dasgupta actually prove that the practical person is the one that matters, rather than the person-likes entity?
He offers 4 distinct supporting arguments, which he calls 3 easy pieces, plus 1 more. The first is the argument from moral wrong. It is beautifully simple. We have incredibly strong intuitions that claim 1 is true, the act was wrong. We have strong theoretical reasons to hold claims 2 and 3, the person-affecting principle and the counterfactual comparative view. If you accept 1, 2, and 3, basic logic dictates that claim 4 must be false regarding the morally relevant entity. It logically entails that the entity that matters must be one that would have existed if they waited. It is not an ad hoc trick. It is a direct deduction from our strongest ethical premises.
That makes sense. It is basically saying, let the math do the work. If 1, 2, and 3 are solid, 4 has to give way. What is the second argument?
The second is the argument from badness. Even if you are skeptical of claim 2, the strict connection between wrongness and harm, you probably still have a very strong intuition that conceiving immediately was profoundly bad for Shia. If you combine that raw intuition of badness with claim 3, the counterfactual comparative view, you arrive at the exact same conclusion. For it to be bad for her, she must be the kind of entity that would have existed in the better alternative. Again, this points directly to the practical person with a flexible essential profile, not the rigid person-like entity.
And then we get to the equivalence argument, which uses Derek Parfit's famous no-difference case. Parfit compared the immediate conception case with a scenario where a mother conceives a healthy child, but then takes a drug like heroin during pregnancy that causes the exact same disability. Intuitively, these two acts seem equally morally wrong.
Precisely. For standard philosophers, explaining why they are equally wrong is a nightmare, because in the heroin case, it is the same child before and after the drug, so you can easily say you harm them. But in the conception case, they think it is a different child entirely, so they have to invent wildly complex, disjointed ethical theories to explain why two fundamentally different metaphysical situations result in the exact same moral wrongness. Flexistentialism explains it effortlessly. In both the heroin case and the immediate conception case, the parents are harming the exact same entity, the practical person. The flexible essential profile means the practical person is present in both the actual and counterfactual scenarios in both cases. The simplest explanation wins.
The elegance of that is really appealing. It unifies the ethical framework perfectly. Now the final argument is the argument from coherent wishes. This one feels the most intuitive to me as a human being. It deals with what Shah herself might actually feel about her situation.
Right? Imagine Shia grows up, suffers from her condition, and says, I wish my parents had waited a month so I wouldn't have to suffer like this. That is a deeply coherent, rational, and tragic wish. But if you deny flexistentialism and believe she's a person-like entity, her wish is literally incoherent. Because if they waited, her specific genetic makeup wouldn't exist. So anti-flexistentialists are forced to tell this suffering person, actually you are metaphysically confused. Wishing your parents waited is identical to wishing for your own non-existence. That is a horrible bullet to bite. Flexistentialism validates her lived experience. She is wishing for a counterfactual world where she, the practical person, exists and is healthy. It is perfectly coherent.
I love that argument because it grounds this lofty metaphysics in real human psychology. But wait, couldn't a critic push back and say, why on earth did we ever assume that the person-like entity was the one that mattered in the first place? Did we just blindly accept biological genetics as metaphysical essence?
Dasgupta points out exactly that. There is no compelling reason to favor the person-like entity. In the philosophy of personal identity, most theories focus on psychological continuity, not strict bodily or origin identity. And in moral philosophy, theories about moral standing usually focus on sentience or consciousness. But sentience doesn't narrow it down. Out of the infinity of coincident objects occupying Shah's chair, millions of them are sentient. The pre-theoretic belief that only one entity is sitting there, and that it definitely wouldn't exist if the parents waited, is just a false presupposition shattered by unlimited essentialism.
This really highlights a massive methodological shift in the paper. Dasgupta uses what he calls an ethics-first approach. Instead of letting some rigid, unexamined metaphysical assumption dictate what we are allowed to believe about ethics, he reverses the polarity.
Exactly. The standard approach treats metaphysics as a brick wall that ethics has to crash into. Dasgupta says no, our ethical intuitions about wrongness, harm, and coherent wishes are incredibly robust. We should use those ethical judgments to guide our metaphysics, to figure out which of the infinite coincident entities we actually care about. It is very similar to debates in personal identity, where we use our intuitions about moral responsibility and punishment to figure out what constitutes the self over time.
But what if someone simply refuses to accept those massive metaphysical assumptions we made earlier? What if they reject ontic essentialism or unlimited essentialism? Does Dasgupta's whole flexistentialist house of cards collapse?
Not at all. Dasgupta anticipates this. He says assumptions A and B were just there to make the ontological mechanics clear. If you prefer descriptive essentialism, the whole argument still works. You just translate it. Instead of saying there are distinct physical entities, you say there are distinct ways of describing the singular physical object, and our moral norms are sensitive to descriptions with flexible essential profiles rather than rigid biological descriptions. Furthermore, this framework extends beautifully beyond the Shah case. Take Mary's choice, where she can conceive now or wait 10 years. The practical person there is simply Mary's first child, completely indifferent to who the biological father is. Or Mike's IVF case, choosing between Spanish or Chinese donor gametes. The relevant entity is the zygote formed by Mike, regardless of its genetic origin.
It even scales up to macro issues, doesn't it? Like environmental conservation, which notoriously suffers from the different number problem. If we choose to pollute today, the ripple effects change who meets who, and centuries from now, an entirely different population of humans will exist than if we conserved.
Yes, flexistentialism solves the environmental non-identity problem beautifully. The morally relevant entity in the future isn't tied to specific sperm and eggs. The essential property is just being a future human, individuated by qualitative roles, like the person occupying role Roan in the year 2300. Because those individuating profiles overlap across possible worlds, an actual descendant suffering in a polluted world can correspond directly to a counterfactual person thriving in a conserved world. We can genuinely say we harmed them.
We have covered incredible ground here, moving from a deeply frustrating ethical paradox down into the weeds of coincident entities and schmeeple, and back up to a unified ethical theory. So, to wrap this up, how strong of a claim is Dasgupta actually making at the end of this paper? Has he definitively destroyed the non-identity problem once and for all?
No, and he is very careful about his conclusion. Establishing that this alternative view is coherent is enough to show that the ethical conclusions standardly drawn from these examples are less motivated than we thought. He isn't claiming flexistentialism is the absolute, unquestionable truth, but by proving that this flexible, ethics-first metaphysics is internally coherent and solves the paradox without abandoning our core moral principles, he demonstrates that we never had to surrender to the non-identity problem in the first place. The standard pessimistic conclusions were based on optional, highly contestable metaphysical dogmas.
Establishing that this alternative view is coherent is enough to show that the ethical conclusions standardly drawn from these examples are less motivated than we thought. That is a brilliant place to leave it. It opens the door back up for common sense morality to operate without violating logic. Thank you for walking us through this dense but incredibly rewarding paper. And to our listeners, next time you eat breakfast, try not to worry too much about the schmeeple. See you next time on Philosophical Frontiers.